Over the last few years, we've seen some pretty shocking behavior from politicians. It's no surprise that many people have become frustrated, disillusioned, and deeply skeptical about government. So where does that leave Christians? The Bible tells us to be subject to the governing authorities. But what does that actually mean? Does it mean we simply obey whatever the government says without question? Or is there more to it? Let's begin with Romans chapter 13, verse 1.
Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities.
Now it's worth remembering when Paul wrote those words. This was around AD 56 or 57, and the emperor was Nero, not exactly someone remembered for good government. Paul was also correcting a misunderstanding among some Christians. There were people who thought that because they now belonged to Christ, earthly governments no longer mattered. Their citizenship was in heaven, so why bother with earthly authorities? Paul says, no. Christians are still to live faithfully in this world, and that includes their attitude towards government. So again,
Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities.
but what does be subject actually mean? Does it mean blind obedience? Does it mean never questioning those in power? And what about Christians living under cruel dictatorships? What are they supposed to do? These aren't just theoretical questions. We don't know what circumstances we may face in the future, so it's important to understand what the Bible is really teaching. Let's look a little more closely at the language Paul uses. In the New Testament, several Greek words mean to obey quite strongly, but Paul doesn't use any of them here. Instead, he uses the word translated be subject. The very same word appears in Ephesians 5:21.
Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ.
Now think about that for a moment. If submit simply meant obey, then every Christian would be trying to give orders to every other Christian. That clearly isn't what Paul means. The same word is also used in the passages about wives submitting to their husbands. Again, it doesn't mean the husband becomes some kind of sergeant major barking out orders. In fact, Paul has already said,
Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ.
that includes husbands towards wives, wives towards husbands, and believers towards one another. So biblical submission isn't blind obedience. It's recognizing that others have a rightful claim upon us. As Christians, we recognize one another as belonging to Christ, and therefore we don't simply insist on our own way. Paul says we should think about governing authorities in a similar way. We recognize that government itself is an authority established by God, so we willingly place ourselves under that authority. Let's continue reading Romans 13.
Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong.
Paul says that the government itself is something God has established. Whether it's a monarchy, a republic, or even an oligarchy, the principle is the same. Government is part of God's ordering of society. As Paul says,
There is no authority except that which God has established.
now we need to be careful about what Paul is and isn't saying. He isn't necessarily saying that every individual ruler has personally been chosen by God. That may sometimes be true, but that's not his main point here. His point is that government itself, the institution of law, justice, and civil authority, is ordained by God. Take Nero, for example. We simply don't know whether God specifically appointed Nero to become emperor. But Paul is clear that the office Nero occupied was one that God had established. Having said that, the Bible also shows that there are occasions when God does raise up particular rulers to fulfill his purposes. One example is in Jeremiah chapter 27, where God says,
With my great power and outstretched arm I made the earth and its people and the animals that are on it, and I give it to anyone I please. Now I will give all your countries into the hands of my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon.
So when we think about resisting or even overthrowing a government, we need to approach the subject with great care. Paul's warning is serious.
Whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves.
The word translated as rebels is quite vivid. It describes someone setting themselves in opposition, almost like an army drawing up its battle lines. In other words, this isn't talking about disagreeing with a government policy or criticizing those in power. It's describing someone who places themselves in deliberate and continuing opposition to the authority God has established. Paul warns that such people will bring judgment on themselves, because God often uses earthly authorities as instruments of his judgment. Having said that, we've already seen that governments have God-given responsibilities. They are to punish wrongdoing, uphold justice, and from Paul's first letter to Timothy, chapter 2, we get another hint of what governments should do.
To enable people to live peaceful and quiet lives.
So if a government completely abandons those responsibilities, if it becomes oppressive, murders innocent people, and refuses to protect its citizens, there may be circumstances where resistance is justified. Paul then continues in Romans 13.
Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. This is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants, who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor.
Now, the word translated here as respect is actually the word fear. It's likely that Paul is saying that because this authority has been established by God, we should ultimately fear God as we recognize the office of government. Most English translations use the word respect because the Bible consistently teaches us to fear God, not earthly rulers. Jesus made that distinction very clearly in Luke chapter 12.
I tell you, my friends, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, and after that can do no more. But I will show you whom you should fear. Fear him who, after your body has been killed, has authority to throw you into hell.
In other words, human governments have limited authority. God's authority is absolute. Peter makes the same distinction in his first letter when he writes,
Show proper respect to everyone, love the family of believers, fear God, honor the emperor.
Notice the different words Peter uses. We are to fear God, but we are to honor the emperor. The reverence that belongs to God alone is never transferred to any earthly ruler. Paul also reminds us that this is why Christians pay taxes. We support the work of government because we recognize that God has appointed civil authorities to carry out their proper responsibilities. Jesus addressed exactly this issue when the Pharisees tried to trap him by asking,
Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not?
Jesus asked for a coin, pointed to Caesar's image on it, and then replied,
So give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's.
Taxes, then, are not simply an inconvenience. They are something we owe. They are a debt, a moral obligation, as part of living under the authorities God has established. Hopefully, this discussion has provided a solid biblical foundation for thinking about the Christian's relationship with governing authorities. Of course, it also opens the door to several other important questions. What about capital punishment? Is pacifism the biblical position? Should Christians fight in times of war? And what should the relationship between the church and the state actually look like? They're all fascinating subjects, but we'll have to leave those for another podcast.